Everything you need to know about products and services that can improve your life. This is Experts on Call on CIL 650.
Welcome back. This is CIL 650. Talk about strata. It's our evening show talking about issues with respect to strata corporations. And here in the studio, Adrian Murray is joining us tonight. And we're talking about bylaws, enforcement, and hearings and the hearing process that we've gone through. We've been through a bunch of emails. We've got a few more to tackle that deal with some up changes that have just occurred to the legislation over the past year that also have a bit of an impact for strata owners. Adrian, here's an email that we got from an owner about their assessment or their cost for painting of their building. And it says our AGM package includes a resolution for a special assessment for $100,000 for painting requiring a 3/4 vote approval. Is this not, because it was an item in our depreciation report, simply a majority vote of the owners?
Well, it's an interesting question, and the short answer is quite possibly. The amendments to the Act, there were significant amendments to the Act in April of 2014 to the Strata Property Act, and one of the things that changed was how to get money out of the Contingency Reserve Fund. So up until this amendment, the Contingency Reserve Fund was to be used for those expenses that occur less often than annually. So the, once every 3 or 4 or 5 years, the capital type expenditures. And to get the money out of the Contingency Reserve Fund, you needed a 3/4 vote. Well, previously, the government had introduced depreciation reports and the requirement that strata corporations obtain depreciation reports unless they waived them. Well, the government then came back in April 2014 and said, well, if a strata corporation has a depreciation report and the depreciation report requires some work to be done, the owners are able to take the money out of the Contingency Reserve Fund by a majority vote. And that's a significant change. So if you've got a depreciation report that requires work to be done, the strata is able to put forward a resolution by majority vote in order to have the funds withdrawn from the Contingency Reserve Fund and have the work carried out.
It's kind of interesting because there was an earlier amendment a year earlier, actually, that removed the limit on how much a strata could contribute to a contingency reserve fund without the need for a 3/4 vote.
Exactly.
Right?
There's the depreciation report. Now, this is sort of all coming in stages. The requirement for the depreciation report was actually contained in an amendment to the Strata Property Act in 2009, but was not brought into force at that time because additional regulations had to be provided or prepared. It was then brought into force with an effective date. It was brought in 2011, and beginning in 2013, stratas were required to obtain depreciation reports or waive them. We've then seen amendments to the Act that changed the contribution levels, and the big change there was that if the contribution to the Contingency Reserve Fund reached 100% of the operating budget in the past, then a 3/4 vote was required to save more money. Well, now that 3/4 vote's gone. So all contributions to Contingency Reserve Fund after 25% are simply based on majority vote. We also see things like amendments to the Contingency Reserve Fund and operating fund. First of all, the operating fund, funds can be taken out of the operating fund to pay for a depreciation report. And so that addressed the issue
majority
of
vote again.
whether it was,
right.
Even though it was an expense that may not occur annually, we can just put it in the operating budget for a year and
right.
approve it by majority vote. We could also take the money of the Contingency Reserve Fund by majority vote to obtain a depreciation report. So there's a number of provisions in the Act and the regulations that are being amended to respond to and to address the issue of depreciation reports and make it easier for strata corporations to obtain them and carry out the work when the work is needed.
So basically, in a nutshell, it's easier to save money and spend money if you've planned for it through long-term planning and depreciation reports, and it's a higher test now for special levies. So it's encouraging stratas, in essence, to save money and to use that money that they've saved on routine depreciation projects.
That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. One other email here, which I think is kind of interesting, and I know that we all love noise complaints, so it's always a bit of a challenge because they're so subjective. But an owner who lives on the 10th floor of a concrete high-rise building, she has constant noise from the children upstairs, banging, running, thumping. There's all kinds of stuff going on upstairs, and it goes on day after day. She's written a letter to the Strata Council. Strata Council have written back saying noise is something that naturally happens in buildings. You just have to tolerate it. But it's now come to the point of unbearable for her. So the Strata Council said this is the other side of bylaw issues. If the Strata Council doesn't really enforce bylaws, what does an owner do? That's the other side of this.
Well, again, at this point in time, the recourse is to courts. So an owner may retain legal counsel. The legal counsel may advise the strata to enforce the bylaw. If it doesn't happen, then it's a court process. In the future, this will also be addressed by the Civil Resolution Tribunal, which will mean that stratas will have to take these complaints seriously and can't just ignore owners' complaints.
Well, and I think that's one of the transitions we're seeing in our justice system now is with the introduction of the tribunal, is that strata councils, strata corporations, and owners are going to have a better arsenal to be able to deal with the disputes that aren't going to cost as much or take as long, and won't require the same type of voting threshold.
Well, that's right. And the other hope in all of this is that the dispute can get resolved and people can go on living in their homes and with each other, because this is a community of people. And if these disputes are allowed to carry on for long periods of time and allowed to fester, they can create some very, very unpleasant living circumstances for many people. And I think another aim in all of this is problems arise when we live together collectively. Let's resolve the problems and let's move on.
Well, and I think someone summed it up nicely when they said what may be trivial disputes to you and I, to the people who live with them day to day, are in fact quite disruptive and damaging to their lifestyle. So that if that's what we get out of the tribunal with respects to better life for everybody, that's just a great thing. Thank you very much for joining the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to our show tonight. Again, if you want to be up to date on the Civil Resolution Tribunal, go to www.civilresolutionbc.ca. My email is tony@choa.bc.ca. Happy strata living, and thanks for listening to our show.